Okay. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm Thomas Amundrud, Associate Professor of English Education at Nara University of Education in Japan. And today I'll be talking about what's going on. So looking at early career teacher practices through SFMDA and LCT. So I'm really kind of developing on some other talks. I think some of you have seen some of my talks elsewhere, like Carl, you were at my talk for the roundtable. So I'm really sort of developing and expanding on some issues that I talked about elsewhere and bringing it all together. So when we're looking at pedagogy, one of the basic questions we always have to decide, well, how are we going to look at this multimodal pedagogy, and especially in multilingual environments, such as a EFL classroom? The answer that I'm using, of course, is SFMDA, so analyzing meaning potential of semiotic resources across strata, as well as LCT, so examining different forms taken of different fields of human endeavor, organized in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And to look at this in our presentation today, first I'll be telling you about the data and overall situation, a bit of Japanese English education. I get the sense from our presentations earlier that we're dealing with lots of different teaching environments. I don't hear anyone yet from a foreign language teaching environment, so give you some information about that. And then I'll give a brief overview of my three foundational frameworks in SFL, MDA, and LCT. And then the current views of my research, looking at pedagogy, multimodality, and LCT, semantic gravity, and autonomy. And at the end, kind of a coda, talk about some implications that I see for language teaching and language teacher training. So just to make clear, the purpose of this research is to try to understand how Japanese teachers of English in secondary schools are deploying classroom space and gesture in conjunction with language in their lesson. So I'm not really looking at the student texts and utterances like Mark's talk, for example. So about English education in Japan, basically foreign language education is synonymous with English and it's a part of the Japanese school curriculum from the 5th year of elementary school. And that really started from this year. Before it was a kind of an activity, but it wasn't really a part of the curriculum formally, but now it's formally a part of the curriculum from last year. And all schools, public and private, follow what's called the course of study, that's dictated by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, in Japanese, Monbuka Gakusho, but we abbreviate it as MEXT. So when you see MEXT, that just means the Japanese Ministry of Education. Anyway, so the point is that 98% of all students who complete high school are going to have 8 years of English education. Sorry, 98% of the students who complete high school, are going to have 8 years of English education. And from the changes from last year, it's going to be 10. All right. So that seems like quite a bit. But this is within the larger context of the fact that English education has been described as being in decline, such as according to the Education First English Proficiency ranking from last year. Now, of course, there are problems with rankings like this, but they do both give a sense of a dis-ease as well as contribute to that dis-ease of Japan regarding its English proficiency of students in relative to its closest neighbors and economic competitors, namely South Korea and China. So what are the students learning anyway? Now, since 1989, there's been a stipulation that they should be using oral communication, CLT, communication language teaching lessons, okay? And the classes, at least from 2020, are supposed to be taught in English. But if you examine some of these discussions, like I just saw a recent presentation by a promising young grad student from UBC to Kajigai 2021 last weekend, that shows in the actual discussion of these policy implementations, it's actually connected to a neoliberal agenda of fostering global human resources, of trying to get students to be able to use English so they can communicate better and to develop a kind of more globalized workforce. So that's kind of the motivation behind this rather than necessarily an educational motivation. And we can see some examples from some policy documents here where you can see, for example, that classes are supposed to be conducted in English in lower secondary and upper secondary schools, things like information exchanges and presentations, etc. So that's what the policy says. All right. So with that in mind, I wanted to collect data from upper secondary, high school, lower secondary, junior high school classrooms. The data I'll be showing you all today is from a second year private high school class. This school was at the lower end of informal prefectural ranking in the prefecture in Western Japan it came from. And those 38 students, the textbook that they were using, Power on English Communication 2, it consists of compartmentalized thematic units on topics of social interest. This is common to Japanese textbooks. So each unit is about a different topic. Like this unit was about car sharing. All right, so that's my data. And what are the students studying? So you have this notion that they're doing communicative English, that they're giving presentations, that they're doing discussions, okay, on paper. But a lot of study in English, the study of English in Japan is really associated with what's called Juken Eigo, or English for entrance examinations that emphasizes more grammar, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. And these textbooks are often, quote, predicated on the assumption that the teachers are going to be using translation as a primary means of conveying meaning, so that the textbook is in English, but that most of the talk in the class is going to be in Japanese. And this kind of reflects a contradictory position of the teachers vis-a-vis both the ministry guidance that they're supposed to be teaching in English, but also the classroom practice that, well, translation is an accepted part of the curriculum. The guidance may say that you're supposed to teach in English, but there's no actual way of enforcing that. Okay. That said, though, if we focus too much, like some research has done on EFL in Japan, they focus too much on the notion that Juken Eigo is really endemic to EFL here. It overlooks the work by Japanese teachers as an educationalist, like the teacher you're going to see in my data, to try to develop sort of more communicative and functional language education, but it still points to some persistence as inadequacies in language teacher education here. Like, for example, the teaching practicums here are only 2 weeks rather than 6 months or more elsewhere in the world. So it's within this tension that the present study is investigating, and we'll see if it intervenes. So my research question is basically, how do these complementary analyses, looking at pedagogic register, multimodal classroom space and gesture, and semantic gravity and autonomy, reveal sort of the separate yet complementary aspects of pedagogy? So we're going to look at pedagogy first. And I'm using the same excerpt throughout. So while I'm talking about this, you can look at the excerpt here on the screen. And I'm analyzing pedagogy according to moves, so where speaker change could occur without being seen as interruption, and looking at in terms of exchange, pedagogic register, and language shift. Okay, so exchange is pretty well known in SFL, so I'm not going to go into so much detail from that, thanks to the pioneering work from Margaret Berry and developed by Jim Martin and David Rose. But I am going to talk a little bit about pedagogic register and language shift, because I think these are really useful tools for looking at what goes on in classes. All right, so pedagogic register. David Rose proposed that in his 2018 article in the sadly defunct Functional Linguistics Journal, which everyone if you're doing SFL, download articles from that as quickly as you can. Who knows how long Springer will have it up, but it's still there for now. But pedagogic registry he proposed as a subset of the overall potential of register for pedagogic activities specifically. Now he's got a number of systems in there. I'm using 3: interact, act, and cycle phases. So interacts, that models the teacher and student roles. Acts, those model the observable, behavioral, and inferable conscious acts of sensing, thinking, and feeling. And then also cycle phases, and that models the phases of the learner activities. And I'll be demonstrating that in a moment. But also, I'm looking at language shift, and that describes the multilingual classroom interactions where the meaning making is happening in two or more languages. And I'd use this instead of, say, translanguaging or code switching, because it's explicitly designed by SFL researchers, Harni Kartika Ningsi, to describe the structure of how participants and especially teachers choose the languages that they use and how they shift between them, both within and between moves. Okay, so for those of us working with the SFL framework, I think language shift is a great tool to use, and I strongly recommend it. So let me walk you through this transcript briefly. Um, After closing that initial IRF segment before this, the teacher Kenta, this of course is a pseudonym, he inquires for knowledge to focus the students on answering the questions. And what I love about pedagogic register is that, inquiring for knowledge to focus. You can just read it left to right. Okay. To answer the DK1 that's posed in moves 1 through 3. Now, the students propose an answer in line 4, but that's rejected, but it's used to prepare for successful language display in lines 4 through 8. He then praises and inquires again, okay, clarifying the focus with an interim move, L1 language shift, and prepares the students to successfully display the knowledge at the end. Okay, so this segment, as you can read, is the students trying to figure out, okay, well, what happens when we decrease car sharing? He acts like in line 2. Okay, the students want to say, well, it's CO2. Yeah, but what happens before that? Okay, as he sees it in line 7, before you start sharing something, what decreases first? Okay, and then the number of cars decreases, and then what decreases before then in line 10. Okay, so we actually have to decrease the number of cars and the number of gasoline before we can actually decrease CO2. So we're building collective knowledge in that way. All right, so that's just the pedagogy. Now looking at space and gesture. Now, this is an SFL conference, so you all know, of course, that meaning is modeled as a systems of choice between what was expressed and what could have been but wasn't. And when we look at classroom space, the system that I have developed from it in my dissertation, from Faye Victor Lim's dissertation itself as well, we model it similarly. Now, classroom space, this is a system in the interpersonal metafunction, because material proximity communicates semiotic proximity, as Christian Mathis said. And the system of classroom space is developed on the position of teachers relative to the students and the kinds of teaching and meaning making that they do. Now, the data that I have, I'm seeing mainly work in the authoritative at the top and the monitoring space at the bottom, as you'll see in the next slides. All right, so for example, in line 2, Kent is moving through the student rows, and he brings the students into the classroom text through deictic pointing gestures, such as this palm up deictic gesture that you see in line 2. Okay, but through the monitoring space, as I showed you earlier briefly. Okay, he's walking and monitoring student work, and that way he's able to ensure the student's compliance. Hence the semiotic nature of interpersonal space. Somatic nature, excuse me. All right, that's classroom space. Representing action. Okay, in my study, I'm modeling gestural semiosis in terms of representing action. Okay, it provides systemic options for gestures that are both correspondent to and independent of language. Now, I'm following Martin Sepavigna 2019 and saying that it's hypothesizing that it's coinciding. I think they say concurring with discourse semantics. I'm saying coincide because I'm researching pedagogic gestures specifically. And so the range of meanings is limited in terms of register. And so the representing actions kind of map onto these classes and activities in particular. Okay. And I see this as sort of providing an additional layer of delicacy to the broader description of paralanguage that Martin and Sepavigna propose. Okay. So it's sort of additional to that. Because it's helping to represent semiosis and it's describing the meanings that are embodied in that context. And through the system, We are positing gestures as activities that illustrate or embody a change in position, items that depict real or abstract entities or emblems, or qualities that demonstrate the characteristics of an item. Now, admittedly, in this data, I've only found activities and items, and in my dissertation, I only found 1 or 2 examples of qualities. These represent what on Kinden's continuum are called metaphorics or icons or emblems, but the relation to language is more distinct. Now, this is just ideational, meaning in addition to this, I also do look at textual actions in the study. These are committed by didactic pointing gestures, through which the teacher, as you saw earlier, brings other ideas and people into the talk. So how does this all work? Okay, you can see here in line 3, okay, where he says, shifting from authoritative space to from monitoring space to authoritative space in line 3. Okay, and then in line 5, okay, he says, Kinta says, oh, what happens before that? Okay, so he's visualizing the epistemic space of the correct answer, which the class gets to in line 15. Okay, that action before that, okay, that's an activity. Okay, it's visualizing the same time, the same meaning, correspondent with language. All right, next thing, line 10. Okay, Kenta visualizes the reasoning he's co-creating with the students with a language correspondent representing action and activity. Okay, large upward to downward slope in A, daisu ga hereba, nani ga heru. Okay, if the amount of cars decreases, what else decreases? Again, visualizing an activity, the decrease. He repeats this in line 11 in L2 English, but these both demonstrate the language correspondent representing actions. That's akin to the processes that are described or instantiated in the corresponding utterances. But we're just talking about describing the gestures here, right? How does this actually support the learning? That's in our next section about semantic gravity. Okay, last example, line 14. This starts out as a deictic, right? He's pointing out at this graphic that's projected onto the whiteboard, showing a crossed-out car and fuel pump. You can see in the image. Okay, that's connecting through the oral, the textual med function. That's connecting the oral, image, and gestural text enacted in this lesson. But then he moves his outstretched hand downwards to decrease that, turns this into a language correspondent action. And again, these representing actions are shown through semantic gravity to actually unpack the meanings that are co-present in the language as well. And that's where we're moving to in our next section. Okay, there's already been some explanation of LCT, so I'm not going to go into much detail. But as you can see, again, semantic gravity, just remember, okay, SG plus, the more closely related meaning is to the context. SG minus, it's less dependent on meaning. And of course, Carl Mayton is here, so why am I even saying that? The translation device that I'm using, thank you very much, Carl, for clarifying this was developed by both you and Yagen in 2020, and I hope to see your article that will be coming out later this year, hopefully, where semantic gravity is hypothesized into types and subtypes. Okay, symbolics that display their stability of meanings through position in their specialized symbolic domains, and manifests, where the meaning is not given by their location to specialized domain, but it's more dependent on the context. Okay, in the data that I have, symbolic materials were by far the dominant example that comprised 9 out of 10 of verbal moves. And that's because the register field is stable. Okay, it's concerning car sharing and the associated topics, such as the decrease of the consumption of natural resources and therefore CO2. And so that remains stable within its conceptual domain, but these items are all potentially physically perceivable. But even so, it's all rather abstract, excuse me. Sorry, skip past that. Sorry about that. Okay. And so overall semantic gravity is pretty low, okay? And the teacher's expounding in both languages on fairly abstract and symbolic concepts, albeit ones which are grounded, excuse me, in the student's physical experience. So one way that Kenta's explanation is modulated is through what are called from Dorian Meton, determinate physicals, where the semantic gravity is modulated through the utterances and gestures. As you can see here, again, the pulling back, the decrease of CO2, and the decrease in the number of cars, okay? What these gestures do is themselves helping to make the semantic gravity more grounded, okay? Increasing the semantic gravity, excuse me if I misspoke earlier, okay? As well. Beyond that, we also have modulation through exchange. Um, Kenta's delayed primary narrow moves in line 10. It decreases the semantic gravity after increasing it after the student's secondary narrow move in line 9 increased. Okay, and you see this again in line 9, lines 13, 14, and 15, which I call a mutual modulation of semantic gravity in response to student uptake. So these moves, although the student utterances are quite short, okay, it helps bring the semantic gravity a bit closer to the context. All right. So through semantic gravity, the two means through which Kenta and his students are modulating the relatively low semantic gravity of these utterances is both through the representing actions that are doubling at the same time as determinate physicals, as well as the increasing semantic gravity of the utterances that they accompany, and through the mutual modulation through teacher-student delayed primary and or exchanges. And this helps create class collective knowledge. All right. Sorry to be moving fast, but I just want to show you briefly. This is what I showed you just now up to semantic gravity. This is what I've been working on so far. And hopefully this will be appearing in an article next year. What I'm showing you now is for my next work. This is what I'll be presenting more about at the LCT 3.5 in January, looking at autonomy. Now, positional autonomy and relational autonomy in LCT, PDA is concerned with the strength of relations between the elements of a context and those from outside of the context. And for this, I was hypothesizing that the core is going to be the EAP light content of the textbook about car sharing, while the focus on language elements was more ancillary, but that the overall target is teaching English in English, while the target is teaching in L1 Japanese. Again, this is not to say that using Japanese is negative or shouldn't be done, because you'll see that the Japanese actually enables students to bring in understandings from Japanese into the English, and this is used strategically, I believe, by the teacher in his class. Okay, relational autonomy, that's concerned with the strength of relations between the principles from a context and those from outside that context. And in this study, I'm hypothesizing that that target is just the content, the curricular content, or the focus on language, and non-target is other associated purposes. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, we have regular return trips from the sovereign to the introjected codes, okay, where the teacher is taking knowledge from Japanese, bring it into the English and back again, okay? And this happens throughout this segment that I showed you. Okay, so the current version of my autonomy translation shows these primarily sovereign and introjected codes. This isn't the case. Some of the data you'll be seeing later on for my study does include some one-way trips. There are some trips into the Yagozata code that don't really come back. And this seems to mirror what other autonomy studies in other fields are showing. So I really love, as Carl and others have been saying, that when you use LCT, you can see things from completely different fields, but you can see very similar principles at work with the tools that are at hand. So hopefully I'll be able to show you that more in a few months. So racing through all that, What does this mean for teacher training? Um, both of the teachers that were recruited in the study, they're kind of in their first 5 years of teaching. Okay. You just saw one teacher. I'll be showing you more of him and then another teacher from a junior high school, hopefully in January and next year as well. Uh, these are both within their first 5 years of teaching. So they'd be considered somewhere in the novice survival and discovery stage of their careers. So if our goal as researchers and as teacher and teacher trainers, I'm at a university of education, um, is to try to understand and analyze, help improve our teachers' conduct and their multimodal orchestrations. What can some of these findings show us? All right. I think some of the implications are pretty commonsensical. Things like minding your message, thinking about where you stand and who can see you, making sure your gestures and your meanings match, connecting classroom texts with your gesture, space, and gaze. Didn't talk about gaze much today, but hopefully I will in the future. And using your body as your words to help unpack and maybe repack things. We saw lots of down escalators. We didn't see lots of repacking as well. So I'm wondering if gestures and other multimodal tools can be used for that. This doesn't really seem really groundbreaking, right? You're going through using lots of fancy terminology to say stuff that really isn't that, beyond what you could figure out just by, thinking about your own teaching and what you've seen in good classrooms. But the thing about obvious stuff is that it's not obvious to a lot of people, right? Okay. It might be helpful for other teachers as well as in relicensing and refresher courses. But still, I do wonder if there's something more. All right. So I'm not done yet. I'm wondering if I can add to this list. So my next steps, 3.5, LC 3.5, I'll be exploring autonomy in more detail. And I'm thinking to present examples from both Kenta's data and from my other teacher participant, and to try to think of how this can help refine the autonomy translation device and try to road test with other data from the study and ultimately prepare a monograph that's going to be summarizing all of these findings. So that's all for me. Thank you very much for your attention. And I do have 2 minutes for questions. So I'm sorry, it's hard for me to see everyone because I've got my slides up. So I'll try to make it so I can see people. So if you have any questions, comments, I'd appreciate them now. And I wasn't able to see if there was anything in the chat. All right. I don't want to ask you to clap for myself. Sorry, that would be too much, even though I'm the room host. But seriously, any questions, comments? I know some of you either teach or you have learned in ESL or ESL environments. I'd be curious to hear if any of this seems useful to you. Yeah, I'm sorry. You're right. It's a lot to pack in 25 minutes. I had a very helpful rejection say that I tend to use a kitchen sink approach to my writing and my presenting. So maybe that's at work here. Do teachers still have issues with hazakashi? So like the students won't speak up? Is that what you mean? Or the teachers themselves are? Well, that's separate from what I'm currently researching, but I will say yes. In my own, this is talking about my dissertation. I looked at teacher-student consultations, and though in those consultations, because there were students as well, there was a lot more student utterances. And one of the things I found was that taking a multimodal approach, looking at gesture, but also gaze and the use of space helps one to actually see, okay, maybe the students aren't going to actually be speaking up as much as you might expect in, say, a North American or Anglo-Australian classroom, Anglo-North American, Anglo-Australian classroom, but they will still be showing some participation and possibly responding, for example, through looking down, through their direction, through nonverbal gestures as well. Okay, so I'm wondering if perhaps that answers your question, or the
Yeah, sort of. I'm just wondering, since you're teaching teachers, whether there's been any advance on how to get them to speak up in groups. So, it's a different thing. I know you're teaching teachers, but they may have reported to you, oh, we can't get the students to speak up and to practice, like to actually communicate in English. So that's
one of the things about teacher training here is that a lot of times it's sort of taken as a given that students will not be overly loquacious.
Yeah.
And so it's not so much seen as a problem to solve. It's sort of seen as this is a fact of the situation you're going to have to deal with somehow.
Yeah.
And there's lots of reasons for this. I mean, I mentioned earlier about the assumption of Jukanego that you're going to be using lots of translation anyway. So a lot of the interaction that happens in the classrooms will be in Japanese anyway. And the observations that I did, like in my junior high school, of course these are junior high school kids, second year junior high school kids, they were very active. They were very talkative, mostly in Japanese. And we're talking on topic, by the way. They weren't just chatting, right?
Yep.
But they were interacting. The high school classroom that I observed, I showed you the small example from today. Those students were, of course, much more reserved because high school, it's different in age to some extent. But they were speaking. Getting them to do it in English is more challenging, but I think that's general in most EFL situations overall, or foreign language, because not just English, it's any foreign language. I don't recall being fairly talkative in my French classes when I was in high school in Florida. So,
university's just as bad in Japan, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I had colleagues who reported that the Chinese students who'd come over to Japan to learn and had to take English classes were much more loquacious in class than the Japanese students in English. So it's a sort of cultural thing, isn't it?
It is. There is a major assumption. There's assumption is the wrong word. There is a tendency towards silence. There's a Nakano, I think was her name. She was a CA researcher that did a CA ethnographic study in some high schools here in Japan. And one of the lines I remember was something like, the Japanese classrooms are predisposed to silence as a norm. And I find that true both in my own teaching as well as in my research. Of course, any teacher can learn ways to work with that. That's what a lot of the CLT, the TBLT, and sort of a modified genre-based approach to teaching can help you do.
That was sort of the pointy end of my question. Really, has there been any developments in ways or things that have worked to get Japanese students to be more outspoken in class? It's just an interesting conundrum. I'm just wondering.
I get there. People are certainly working on it. Myself and my colleagues, we certainly work on it. Does it work in all situations, in all cases? No, of course not. And the problem, and this is not my topic, but a view of language policy, like I quoted earlier in my presentation, there's this tension in the policy between sort of the English only, say this is what you should go for, but there's also the sense like, well, but no one's going to actually do it.
No,
and it's okay. And I'm speaking as someone with a strong sort of educational, ethical, political view that translanguaging is actually a good thing. The idea of an English only policy is like about 20, 30 years out of date.
That's right.
But we would like the students to use more English in their English class.
It was like
just like they do math in their math class.
Language teaching, we're teaching communicative language. We have to make them talk, but that's not really the background that you're operating with.
But to answer your question, there are of course plenty of researchers and teachers working in Japan. They're working on developing materials and methods to help encourage that. Is it having any large scale effect? I'm not sure I could say that. It's not that people aren't trying,
Anyway, thanks. That's interesting. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Thank you for your questions, and good to see you again, Don. I recall a very interesting conversation with you at the appraisal symposium in Sydney, 2015.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Anything else? I'm going to stop my recording if that's all for me. We do have one other group of presenters, but I don't believe they have come. Carl, any comments, questions? Mark?
Nothing right at this moment, Thomas. That was very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope my use of the systems was of semantic gravity and appraisal were I'm sorry, of semantic gravity and autonomy were accurate enough.
They seem to make sense. Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you so much for the roundtables, because when I was working on my dissertation, I was always, bumping up, these notifications of these events happening in Sydney. I'm like, it's in Sydney. I can't attend, for better and worse, COVID has been great.
Yeah,
Weird saying
it
that
was an
for me,
opportunity to
for me,
decenter. It was an opportunity to decenter.
yeah. And thank you so much.
LCT.
I really hope LCT as well as SFL will help continue this, because it really, for those of us who aren't in the metropole of both the systems, which is the Sydney metropolitan area, we really benefit from it. So thank you very much.
No, I mean, I think I won't go into it. I think there's a slight, it's just that's a matter of personality, I think, as to whether that will go forward. Personally, I'm a big fan of decentering. So that's why we've done it in LCT.
All right. But thank you very much. Anything else? If there isn't, then I'm going to stop my recording.